Hello. One of the things that's happening with this coronavirus epidemic is that we're all trying to make sense of it. And that made me reflect on the fact that this has always been the way of it with human beings. Ever since difficulties, challenges, and diseases confronted us, we invented stories, ways of understanding that helped us make sense of difficulties like disease. This was true in the time that Jesus was alive and walking the earth. In those days, the narratives or stories that people held to be true were very different from those we have today. And I would suggest to you that they were characterized by two ideas. One was blame and the other was exclusion. Now, consider, for example, the story that we find in John chapter 9, where the man who was born blind at birth comes seeking healing from Jesus. And his disciples say to him, "Who sinned? Given that he was born blind at birth, did he sin or was it his parents?" Now what that shows us is that the dominant idea in those days was that when disability or disease happened, it was the result of sin. But one of the byproducts of that worldview was that the victim was blamed, in this case the poor man who had never been able to see. Jesus' response is very different. It's one of compassion, inclusion, and cure, but we'll come on to that. The other thing that was true was that disease was seen as something that was impure, and there were all sorts of laws and rituals that caused someone with disease to be excluded. So when Jesus was in the crowd and the woman who had uterine bleeding touches the hem of his garment, she does so because she has had many years of simply being excluded from Jewish society because she was considered to be ritually unclean. Jesus has a wonderful response that shows compassion and inclusion. Equally, lepers were seen to be unclean and couldn't be touched. Now, this wasn't because there was a germ theory that they understood or that they thought they were infectious. It was all to do with the religious laws and their ideas of purity. And Jesus broke that law and showed compassion and would touch the leper. Equally, a dead body was seen as impure, yet Jesus took the daughter of Jairus by the hand as he resurrected her from the dead. In short, what we're seeing throughout the Gospels is a changing of the story, a changing of the narrative. Instead of blame and victim blaming, instead of exclusion, Jesus teaches compassion and inclusion. Now, if we bring this up to date and we think about COVID-19 and the coronavirus, we've developed our own set of stories already about it all. Now, these are largely scientific stories, and many of them will turn out to be true, but nonetheless, they're narratives, they're ways of understanding, explaining, and talking to each other about these things. So we think of a virus, first of all, in scientific terms. It's a strip of DNA which can build a capsule round about itself, but it needs a cell, a living cell of an animal or of a human to be able to build that capsule. It then usually causes some infection or difficulty, and so has to move on to another animal or human so that more of the virus can be produced or reproduced. It's the simplest form of organism that we know, more or less. Now, the evolutionary prime directive of all life is to survive. So what the coronavirus had done for presumably centuries was be passed around various animals, probably bats, the ones that cause COVID. And they did so very successfully. But through another mammal host, probably at a wet market in China, the virus jumped into human beings. And so for the first time in history, as far as we know, this particular virus started to infect human beings, causing illness and moving on to the next human being so that the virus can multiply and survive. It has no other imperative but to do that. It's not intending to harm us. It has no intention whatsoever. It is, after all, simply a strip of DNA. That's the story we've told. Does that cause us to think about blame? Not so much in terms of coronavirus, although there are those who have blamed the Chinese, although there are those who have also praised the Chinese for the manner in which they suppressed the COVID infection. But those who blame the Chinese for not having let the rest of the world know early enough. There are those who blame the government for not locking down quickly enough. Equally, there are those who have said the government has overreacted. So there is blame attached to the narrative that we're creating about coronavirus. Is there exclusion? Less so. I think we have a much more compassionate view about disease and suffering. But the virus is infectious. The person who's infected needs to be excluded, self-isolating if not too severe, behind screens of protective clothing if they're in hospital, locked away in nursing homes if that's their circumstance. So we've seen exclusion as well as blame as part of the unfolding story of coronavirus. At the same time, though, we've also seen compassion on the part of healthcare workers, compassion on the part of relatives and friends who have looked after those who are unwell, and inclusion, neighbourliness, a desire to all be in this together. That narrative, of course, has been challenged, but nonetheless, we get to choose. That's one of the wonderful things about the way in which the Christian message has caused our country to have a choice. We don't have to be bound by old-fashioned ideas of blame and exclusion. We can embrace, as Christ taught us, the wonderful values of compassion and inclusion. At the end of the day, we have to decide the path that we take. Thank you.